My sister humiliated me in front of my children, calling me a failure while everyone laughed. I stayed silent, took my kids' hands, and walked out. That night, I made one phone call. By morning, her husband was screaming, my parents were begging me to answer, and my sister finally realized the secret I had hidden from them for years. The secret that would cost them everything. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. I am Nia, 34 years old, and for as long as I can remember, I have been the designated disappointment of my family. To my parents and my older sister Chloe, I am just the struggling single mother, the college dropout who scrapes by doing freelance graphic design from a cramped apartment. They have absolutely no idea that my entire life is a carefully constructed illusion. They do not know that I am the founder and CEO of Apex Holdings, a massive commercial real estate investment firm right here in Atlanta. They also had no idea that my tolerance for their toxic behavior expired tonight. Growing up in our household meant constantly competing for affection that was only awarded based on social status and appearances. My parents, Marcus Sr. and Denise, valued nothing more than looking good in front of their friends and our extended family. Chloe, who is 3 years older than me, learned to play their game perfectly. She was the golden child, the one who wore the right clothes, went to the right parties, and married the right man. Her husband, Preston, is a 40-year-old white man who presents himself as a Wall Street elite and a master of finance. My parents practically worship him. They see his race and his supposed wealth as a golden ticket that elevates our entire family status in the Atlanta social scene. They excuse his arrogance and his condescending attitude because they believe he validates their own success. The private dining room at an exclusive steakhouse in Buckhead was supposed to be a joyous environment. We were gathered there to celebrate my parents' 40th wedding anniversary. The mahogany table was crowded with 20 of our closest relatives, laughing, toasting, and enjoying the lavish spread. I sat quietly near the end of the table, cutting a piece of chicken for my 9-year-old daughter Zuri, while my 14-year-old son Jamal quietly drank his soda. I was perfectly content to stay out of the spotlight and let Chloe and Preston hold court as they always did. The trouble began when the waiter approached the table with the leather check folder. He naturally handed it to Preston, who had spent the entire evening bragging loudly about his latest real estate acquisitions and his 6-figure bonuses. Preston opened the folder, glanced at the total, and let out a theatrical sigh. He whispered something to Chloe, who immediately grabbed the folder from his hands. She stood up slightly, adjusting her expensive designer wig, and deliberately threw the heavy leather folder across the long table. It slid across the white linen and stopped right in front of my plate, knocking over my water glass. "Pay for your portion and your kids, Nia," Chloe announced, her voice cutting through the ambient noise of the restaurant like a siren. "The bill is $2,500. Preston and I are not running a charity. You need to pay up before you leave. You have freeloaded off the success of this family enough." The entire dining room fell dead silent. 20 pairs of eyes turned to stare at me. I could see my aunts and uncles exchanging uncomfortable glances, while some of my cousins tried to hide their amused smirks. The humiliation was designed to be public. It was designed to remind everyone in the room that Chloe was the wealthy, successful sister, and I was the charity case who did not belong at their luxury table. I felt the heat rising in my face, but I maintained my composure. I looked at the bill, and then looked up at Chloe. Before I could formulate a calm response, I felt a sudden movement beside me. My son Jamal, always so fiercely protective of me, reached into his pocket. His hands were shaking as he pulled out a crumpled $20 bill. It was his allowance money, the money he had been saving for weeks from doing chores around our neighborhood. He tried to place it on the table, his young face tight with an emotion no child should have to feel. He just wanted to help his mother. That is when Preston decided to intervene. He walked over to our end of the table and placed his heavy hand on Jamal, pushing my son's shoulder down with a sickeningly fake smile on his face. "Put it away, kid," Preston said, with a condescending chuckle that echoed in the quiet room. "Do not humiliate your mom any more than she already is. Keep your little pocket change. I will cover her tonight. Consider it a charitable donation to the less fortunate. After all, she has been a massive burden on this family ever since she dropped out of college pregnant with you." The words hung in the air, dripping with venom and classist superiority. I felt every muscle in my body go completely rigid. The mention of my past, the direct insult to my son, and the physical way Preston touched my child crossed a boundary that could never be uncrossed. When I became pregnant with Jamal at 20 years old, I had to leave university to care for him. My parents had immediately drained my college savings account and used the money to pay off a massive debt Chloe had accumulated from a failed business venture. They claimed I did not need the money anymore since my life was ruined anyway. I had spent the last 14 years working myself to the bone, building my empire from the ground up, while letting them believe I was still struggling. I looked at my parents, expecting them to finally draw the line. I expected a grandfather to stand up for his grandson. I expected a mother to defend her daughter against such a vile public attack. Instead, my mother Denise took a slow sip of her red wine and nodded in agreement with Preston. "Chloe and Preston are absolutely right, Nia," my mother said, her voice laced with the familiar disgust she reserved only for me. "You should be down on your knees showing some gratitude. Preston is the pride of this family. He takes care of us and he elevates our name. You always have to bring your negative energy and your victim mentality to ruin our special nights. You should be apologizing to your sister and your brother-in-law for being such a financial burden." My father, Marcus Sr., did not even look at me. He just kept cutting his steak, silently validating my mother's words with his complicity. In that exact second, the last remaining thread of loyalty I held for these people snapped. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not try to explain that I could buy this entire restaurant if I wanted to. Emotional reactions were exactly what they wanted from me. They wanted the angry black woman stereotype so they could justify their mistreatment. I was not going to give them that satisfaction. I calmly reached into my designer handbag, which they assumed was a cheap knockoff. I pulled out a crisp $100 bill and placed it gently on top of the leather folder. "This is for the waiter," I said, my voice perfectly steady and dangerously cold. "My children and I do not need the charity of fake millionaires." I stood up and smoothed my dress. I reached out and took Zuri by her small hand and motioned for Jamal to walk ahead of me. My son stood tall, wiping a tear from his eye as he moved away from Preston. I stopped right behind Chloe and Preston, looking directly into my sister's wide, shocked eyes, and then looking at my parents at the head of the table. "Tonight, I am an uninvited guest," I said, making sure every single person in the room could hear the absolute certainty in my voice. "But enjoy this expensive meal while you can, because tomorrow morning you will all be homeless." I turned my back on them and walked out of the private dining room, the heavy wooden doors swinging shut behind me. I led my children out to the front of the restaurant, where my private black Maybach and my personal driver were waiting out of sight from the main windows. We climbed into the quiet luxury of the leather interior. I pulled my children close to me, kissing their foreheads and promising them that no one would ever speak to them like that again. As the car pulled away from the restaurant, heading toward the bright city lights of downtown Atlanta, I pulled out my phone. I stared at the screen for a brief moment, feeling the weight of the decision I was about to make. Then I dialed the direct number to my chief legal counsel. The phone rang twice before he answered. "Marcus," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "Initiate the debt recovery protocol on Preston Company immediately. Freeze every asset call and every loan, and seize the collateral. Take everything." My sister humiliated me in front of my children, calling me a pathetic failure while my entire extended family laughed at her cruel joke. I did not scream. I did not cry. I simply took my kids by their hands and walked out of that private dining room. That night I made one single phone call. By morning, her husband was screaming in pure panic. My parents were begging me to answer the phone, and my sister finally realized the massive secret I had hidden from them for 7 years. The secret that would legally cost them everything they owned. Before I share exactly how I took back my power, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family that underestimated your worth. I am Nia, 32 years old, and for over a decade I have been the designated disappointment of my family. My parents, Vernon and Brenda, valued nothing more than social status and the illusion of wealth. Growing up in our household meant constantly competing for affection that was only awarded based on appearances. My older sister, Chloe, learned to play their game perfectly. She was the golden child, the one who wore the right designer labels, went to the right parties, and eventually married the right man. Her husband, Preston, is a 40-year-old white man who presents himself as a Wall Street elite and a master of finance. My parents practically worship him. They see his race and his supposed wealth as a golden ticket that elevates our entire family status in the affluent circles of Atlanta. They excuse his arrogance and his condescending attitude because they believe he validates their own success. To them, I am just the struggling single mother, the college dropout who scrapes by doing freelance graphic design from a cramped rental house in the West End. They have absolutely no idea that my entire life is a carefully constructed illusion. They do not know that I am the founder and CEO of Apex Holdings, a massive commercial real estate investment firm right here in Georgia. They also had no idea that my tolerance for their toxic behavior expired tonight. The private dining room at an exclusive steakhouse in Buckhead was supposed to be a joyous environment. We were gathered there to celebrate my parents' 40th wedding anniversary. The heavy mahogany table was crowded with 20 of our closest relatives, laughing, toasting, and enjoying the lavish spread. I sat quietly near the end of the table, cutting a piece of chicken for my 9-year-old daughter Maya, while my 14-year-old son Jamal quietly drank his soda. I was perfectly content to stay out of the spotlight and let Chloe and Preston hold court as they always did. Preston spent the entire evening bragging loudly about his latest real estate acquisitions and his massive quarterly bonuses. He swirled his expensive red wine and talked about a $2 million mansion he and Chloe were supposedly closing on the very next day. My parents hung onto his every word, beaming with pride. They completely ignored the fact that my children and I were sitting right there eating a modest chicken dish, while the rest of the table gorged on tomahawk steaks and imported lobster tails. Their blatant disrespect was nothing new. When I became pregnant with Jamal at 18 years old, I had to leave university. My parents were furious about the social embarrassment. They immediately drained my college savings account and used the money to pay off a massive credit card debt Chloe had accumulated from a failed boutique business. They claimed I did not need the money anymore since my life was ruined anyway. They told me I was a lost cause and kicked me out. I had spent the last 14 years working myself to the bone. I started a small design business in a basement, which eventually grew into a massive corporate entity. I kept my wealth a complete secret because I knew exactly what my parents and my sister would do if they found out. They would drain me dry all over again to fund their lavish lifestyles. The real trouble began when the waiter approached the table with the leather check folder. He naturally handed it to Preston, who had been acting like the host all night. Preston opened the folder, glanced at the total, and let out a theatrical sigh. He whispered something to Chloe, who immediately grabbed the folder from his hands. She stood up slightly, adjusting her expensive designer dress, and deliberately threw the heavy leather folder across the long table. It slid across the white linen and stopped right in front of my plate, knocking over my water glass. "Pay your portion and your kids, Nia," Chloe announced, her voice cutting through the ambient noise of the restaurant like a siren. "The bill is $2,500. Preston and I are not running a charity. You need to pay up before you leave. You have freeloaded off the success of this family enough." The entire dining room fell dead silent. 20 pairs of eyes turned to stare at me. I could see my aunts and uncles exchanging uncomfortable glances, while some of my cousins tried to hide their amused smirks. The humiliation was designed to be public. It was designed to remind everyone in the room that Chloe was the wealthy, successful sister, and I was the charity case who did not belong at their luxury table. I felt the heat rising in my face, but I maintained my composure. I looked at the exorbitant bill and then looked up at Chloe. Before I could formulate a calm response, I felt a sudden movement beside me. My son Jamal, always so fiercely protective of me, reached into his pocket. His hands were shaking as he pulled out a crumpled $20 bill. It was his allowance money, the money he had been saving for weeks from doing yard work around our neighborhood. He tried to place it on the table, his young face tight with an emotion no child should have to feel. He just wanted to help his mother. That is when Preston decided to intervene. He walked over to our end of the table and placed his heavy hand on Jamal, pushing my son's shoulder down with a sickeningly fake smile on his face. "Put it away, kid," Preston said with a condescending chuckle that echoed in the quiet room. "Do not humiliate your mom any more than she already is. Keep your little pocket change. I will cover her tonight. Consider it a charitable donation to the less fortunate. After all, she has been a massive burden on this family ever since she dropped out of college pregnant with you." The words hung in the air, dripping with venom and classist superiority. I felt every muscle in my body go completely rigid. The mention of my past, the direct insult to my son, and the physical way Preston touched my child crossed a boundary that could never be uncrossed. I looked at my parents, expecting them to finally draw the line. I expected a grandfather to stand up for his grandson. I expected a mother to defend her daughter against such a vile public attack. Instead, my mother Brenda took a slow sip of her wine and nodded in agreement with Preston. "Chloe and Preston are absolutely right, Nia," my mother said, her voice laced with the familiar disgust she reserved only for me. "You should be down on your knees showing some gratitude. Preston is the pride of this family. He takes care of us and he elevates our name. You always have to bring your negative energy and your victim mentality to ruin our special nights. You should be apologizing to your sister and your brother-in-law for being such a financial burden. My father, Vernon, did not even look at me. He just kept cutting his steak, silently validating my mother's words with his complicity. In that exact second, the last remaining thread of loyalty I held for these people snapped. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not try to explain that my watch alone cost more than their entire meal. Emotional reactions were exactly what they wanted from me. They wanted the angry stereotype so they could justify their mistreatment and call me crazy. I was not going to give them that satisfaction. I calmly reached out and took the $20 bill from the table, handing it back to Jamal. Then I opened my handbag, which they assumed was a cheap fake, but was actually a custom piece. I pulled out a crisp $100 bill and placed it gently on top of the leather folder. This is for the waiter. I said, my voice perfectly steady and dangerously cold. My children and I do not need the charity of fake millionaires. I stood up and smoothed my dress. I reached out and took Maya by her small hand and motioned for Jamal to walk ahead of me. My son stood tall, wiping a tear from his eye as he moved away from Preston. I stopped right behind Chloe and Preston, looking directly into my sister's wide, shocked eyes, and then looking at my parents at the head of the table. Tonight, I am an uninvited guest, I said, making sure every single person in the room could hear the absolute certainty in my voice. But enjoy this expensive meal while you can, because tomorrow morning, you will all be homeless. I turned my back on them and walked out of the private dining room, the heavy wooden doors swinging shut behind me. I led my children out to the front of the restaurant where my private black Maybach and my personal driver were waiting out of sight from the main windows. We climbed into the quiet luxury of the leather interior. I pulled my children close to me, kissing their foreheads and promising them that no one would ever speak to them like that again. As the car pulled away from the restaurant, heading toward the bright city lights of downtown Atlanta, I pulled out my phone. I stared at the screen for a brief moment, feeling the weight of the decision I was about to make. Then I dialed the direct number to my chief legal counsel. The phone rang twice before he answered. "Marcus," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "Initiate the debt recovery protocol on Preston Company immediately. Freeze every asset call and every loan and seize the collateral. Take everything." The sun barely cleared the Atlanta skyline before the consequences of that single command shattered my family's fabricated reality. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse, watching the morning traffic crawl along Peachtree Street. A mug of black coffee warmed my hands. My children were still sound asleep in their rooms, safe and blissfully unaware of the financial earthquake I had just triggered. At exactly 7 o'clock, my phone vibrated against the marble kitchen counter. The caller ID flashed my sister's name. I let it ring 3 times before sliding the screen to accept the call. I did not even have a chance to say hello before Chloe's hysterical voice pierced through the speaker. "Nia, you have to wire me $5,000 right now." There was no greeting. There was no apology for the humiliation she had orchestrated less than 12 hours ago. There was only raw, frantic entitlement. I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting her panic hang in the air. "Good morning to you too, Chloe," I said, keeping my voice perfectly flat. "Do not play games with me, Nia," she shrieked. "I am at the boutique in Phipps Plaza." They opened early for a private viewing, and my personal shopper is standing right in front of me, holding the exact Birkin bag I reserved months ago. I handed them Preston's black card, and it declined. "Do you hear me?" It declined. I smiled into my coffee mug. The speed of Apex Holdings' legal team never ceased to amaze me. "That sounds like a personal financial issue," I replied. "Why are you calling me? You made it very clear last night that I am just a charity case. Surely you do not need a handout from a struggling single mother." "It is a system error," Chloe screamed, her voice cracking with a mixture of rage and sheer humiliation. Preston is on the other line, screaming at the bank executives. They froze his entire portfolio. Every single account is locked. The bank manager is giving us some nonsense about a sudden debt recall from an anonymous holding company. It is a massive glitch, and I am standing here looking like a complete fool in front of the boutique manager. "Wire me the money immediately. Preston will pay you back tomorrow when he gets this sorted out." I walked over to the kitchen island and leaned against the cool stone. The sound of her desperation was intoxicating, but I maintained my absolute composure. "I am afraid I cannot help you, Chloe," I told her. "You see, my pocket change is reserved for my children. I suggest you put the bag down and walk out with whatever dignity you have left." Before she could launch into another tirade of insults, I ended the call. The silence in my kitchen was deeply satisfying, but it was incredibly short-lived. Less than 2 minutes later, my phone rang again. This time my father's picture appeared on the screen. Marcus Sr. never called me this early. In fact, he rarely called me at all unless he needed someone to run an errand that was beneath Chloe. I answered the phone fully expecting him to demand I apologize for walking out of the anniversary dinner. "We have a family emergency," my father barked into the receiver. His voice carried that heavy authoritative tone he used to intimidate his employees and his children. "Good morning, Dad," I said. "Listen to me, Nia," he interrupted, entirely ignoring my greeting. "Preston is dealing with a massive corporate banking issue this morning. Some aggressive private equity firm is trying to execute a hostile takeover of his assets through a loophole. His liquid cash is temporarily tied up in the freeze. He needs immediate capital to float his operations and pay off the retaining lawyers to reverse this mess." "I find it fascinating that the master of Wall Street needs a bailout," I replied. "But I still fail to see how his poor business management involves me." "It involves you because you are part of this family," he snapped. "And right now the family needs to step up and protect our most valuable asset. Preston is the foundation of our reputation. He took care of you last night when you embarrassed us. Now it is your turn to show some loyalty." The sheer audacity of his words made my blood run cold. My own father was demanding my loyalty to a man who had publicly degraded my teenage son just hours prior. He was demanding I sacrifice for the very people who treated me like dirt on their shoes. "I have no money to give him, Dad," I said, playing directly into the impoverished role they had assigned to me years ago. "You know that." "I am not asking for your pennies, Nia," my father scoffed. "I am talking about your grandmother's property, the lot in the West End." My grip on the phone tightened. When my grandmother passed away, she completely bypassed my parents and Chloe in her will. She left me a desolate, overgrown piece of land in the West End of Atlanta. My family had laughed at the inheritance. They called it a worthless patch of dirt in a dangerous neighborhood. They mocked me, saying it was a fitting inheritance for the family failure. For the past decade, I had quietly paid the property taxes, keeping the land exactly as my grandmother had left it. "Preston has a buyer lined up," my father continued, his voice dripping with condescension. "A developer who buys up cheap land in bad neighborhoods. He is willing to give us $200,000 cash for the lot today. It is pennies, but Preston needs the immediate liquidity to unfreeze his accounts. I have already told Preston you will sign the deed over to him this morning. He is having his assistant draw up the transfer paperwork right now." "You promised my property to Preston without even asking me," I asked, making sure he heard the absolute disbelief in my voice. "Do not start being difficult, Nia," my father demanded. "You have done absolutely nothing with that slum for 10 years. You do not have the money or the brains to develop it. Preston needs the cash now. This is your chance to finally be useful to this family instead of being a constant drain on our resources. I expect you at Preston's office by 9 o'clock sharp to sign those papers." He spoke with the absolute certainty of a patriarch who was used to absolute obedience. He fully expected me to bow my head, surrender my only visible asset, and thank him for the opportunity to save his precious white son-in-law. He thought I was weak. He thought I was ignorant. I took a deep breath, letting the cool air of my penthouse fill my lungs. I walked over to my desk and picked up the pristine architectural blueprints I had been reviewing the night before. "I will not be at Preston's office at 9 o'clock, I said, my voice dropping an octave, carrying a weight and authority my father had never heard from me before. "And I will certainly not be signing over my grandmother's legacy to float a sinking ship." "Excuse me," my father growled. "You do not have a choice in this matter. You will do what I tell you to do." "Actually, Dad, I have every choice," I replied smoothly. "You see, Preston does not have a buyer lined up for a cheap slum. Preston has been trying to illegally acquire my property for 6 months because he knows something you apparently do not." "What are you talking about?" my father demanded, his frustration peaking. "That worthless patch of dirt in the West End was just formally rezoned by the city council last week." I explained, my words sharp and precise. "It is now designated for a massive commercial retail center. I know this because my firm spearheaded the lobbying effort. That land is not worth $200,000, Dad. It was just appraised at $5 million. I could hear the sharp intake of breath through the phone, the absolute shock radiating through the cellular connection. $5 million, my father whispered, the number echoing, as if he could not comprehend the magnitude of the wealth he had just mocked. "Yes, $5 million, I said. "Preston knew the rezoning was coming. He tried to trick you into forcing me to sign it over for pennies so he could flip it for $5 million and save his fraudulent company from bankruptcy. He used your desperation for status to try and rob your own daughter." "That is impossible," my father shouted, his denial fierce and desperate. "You are just a jealous, bitter girl making up stories because you could never achieve what your sister has. You know nothing about commercial real estate or high-level finance." I know exactly who owns the debt that is currently crushing him, I replied, my voice unwavering. And I will not give a $5 million property to a criminal just so you can pretend your family is perfect. Do not call my phone ever again. I ended the call and blocked his number before he could formulate another insult. The game of hiding in the shadows was officially over. I placed my phone face down on the desk and looked at the framed photograph of Jamal and Maya. They were smiling radiant and safe. I had protected them from poverty, and now I was going to protect them from the toxic legacy of my own family. I walked toward my master suite to prepare for the day. I had a hostile corporate takeover to finalize, and I needed to dress the part. I stepped out of my closet wearing a tailored emerald suit, cut from Italian silk, and paired it with my favorite black stilettos. The reflection in the mirror was no longer the struggling freelancer my family loved to pity. I was the apex predator of Atlanta commercial real estate, and today, I was finally dressing the part. My driver Marcus was waiting downstairs to take us to St. Jude Preparatory Academy. It is the most exclusive private school in the state, a fortress of brick and ivy, where the city elites send their children. My parents and Chloe always assumed Jamal and Zuri attended the underfunded public school near my old apartment. They had no idea I had been paying the $60,000 annual tuition for each of my children for the past 3 years. The morning drop-off line at St. Jude is usually a quiet parade of European luxury vehicles and polite nods between wealthy parents. I kissed Jamal and Zuri in the back seat, adjusting my daughter's collar before they stepped out of the Maybach. I watched them walk through the wrought iron gates, feeling a profound sense of pride. I had built a fortress around my children to ensure they would never feel the sting of inadequacy that my family had inflicted on me. I was just about to tell Marcus to drive me to the financial district when a loud screech of tires shattered the morning serenity. A beige mid-size rental sedan aggressively swerved into the red zone directly behind my car. Since Preston had his Maserati impounded yesterday, this must have been his desperate replacement. The passenger door flew open and Chloe marched out. She looked entirely unhinged. Her designer wig was sitting slightly off-center, and her makeup looked hastily applied. Preston climbed out of the driver's side, his face flushed red with absolute fury. They must have tracked my phone location through a family sharing app I had forgotten to disable. "You absolute psychopath!" Chloe screamed at the top of her lungs, marching directly across the pristine brick walkway. She did not care who was watching. She did not care about the wealthy mothers in their tennis gear, pausing on the sidewalk to stare. She only cared about asserting her dominance. I stepped out of my car and closed the door behind me, standing tall in my emerald suit. I crossed my arms and watched my sister approach like a raging storm. "What kind of sick game are you playing?" "Nia," Chloe shouted, stopping just 3 feet away from me. "You think you can hack into Preston corporate accounts and freeze our money? You think you can call the bank and pretend to be some debt collector to lock up his portfolio? Do you have any idea how much trouble you are in?" I was humiliated at the boutique this morning. Humiliated. "You are going to fix this right now, or I am calling the police and telling them you are committing wire fraud." Preston stepped up right beside her, aggressively pointing a finger at my face. "You have gone too far this time, you crazy witch." He spat, his voice trembling with unchecked rage. "I do not know what kind of cheap scam you are pulling, but you messed with the wrong man. I know the district attorney personally. I will have you thrown in a federal prison by noon. And how exactly are you affording to drop your kids off at a place like this? Are you stealing money from my accounts to pay for this elite school? I will call Child Protective Services right now and tell them you are an unfit mother involved in organized crime." The other parents in the courtyard began to whisper. A few of the mothers I knew from the Parent-Teacher Association looked at me with deep concern. Chloe saw the audience gathering and her chest puffed out with twisted pride. She lived for an audience and she was determined to use this crowd to tear me down. "Look at her," Chloe announced loudly, gesturing to my outfit with a look of pure disgust. "Look at the welfare queen playing dress-up. You think putting on a nice suit makes you one of these people? You are nothing, Nia. You have always been nothing. You are a college dropout who leeches off our parents. You are a complete failure who has to steal from my husband to buy her way into a rich neighborhood." I did not raise my voice. I did not break eye contact. I just smiled, a slow, chilling smile that made Preston visibly falter. "Are you quite finished, Chloe?" I asked, my voice echoing calmly across the quiet courtyard. "Because you are currently trespassing on private property and making a fool of yourself in front of people who actually matter in this city." My utter lack of fear drove Chloe completely over the edge. She hated when she could not make me cry. She hated when her bullying did not result in my submission. her face twisted into a mask of pure malice. She wanted to hurt me so badly that she was willing to dig up the darkest moment of my professional life just to prove she held the power. "You think you are so smart?" Chloe shrieked, stepping closer to my face. "You think you are some brilliant mastermind. You are exactly the same pathetic loser you were 7 years ago at the Harrison agency. You really thought you were going to get promoted with those stupid graphic design concepts, did you not? You really thought your little portfolio was going to change your life." I kept my face perfectly still, but internally the memory burned. 7 years ago, I had worked as a junior designer at a prestigious marketing firm. I had spent 6 months developing a massive rebranding campaign for our biggest client, working late into the night while raising my kids. "I took your portfolio," Nia Chloe bragged loudly, pointing a manicured finger at my chest. "I stole your entire campaign, and I put my name on it. I handed it directly to the creative director, and I got the senior executive position. And what happened to you? You got fired. I watched security walk you out of the building carrying a cardboard box. I ruined your pathetic little career because you did not deserve to win. You are meant to be at the bottom, Nia. You are meant to stay down there in the dirt. So do not stand here in a stolen suit acting like you have power over me." The wealthy parents standing nearby gasped in absolute horror at her confession. They were completely disgusted by the sheer cruelty of her words. Chloe did not care. She was breathing heavily, a triumphant smirk plastered on her face. She truly believed she had just won the argument. She believed she had put me back in my place. I looked at my sister, absorbing the reality that she had intentionally destroyed my life, and felt absolutely no remorse. That stolen portfolio had almost cost me my apartment. It had almost left my children hungry, but it had also forced me to start my own company. Her betrayal was the catalyst for my empire. "You are right, Chloe," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "You did put me at the bottom. But you forgot that when you bury a seed, it grows." Preston lost what little patience he had left. His white privilege and arrogance could not handle a black woman looking at him with such absolute defiance. He thought he could use physical intimidation to force my compliance. "Listen to me, you little thief," Preston growled, stepping aggressively into my personal space. He raised his right hand, reaching out violently to grab my shoulder and physically force me toward his car. He never even made contact. I raised my right hand and simply snapped my fingers. The response was instantaneous. 2 massive men wearing sharp black suits and earpieces, who had been standing discreetly near the school entrance, lunged forward with terrifying speed. Before Preston could even process what was happening, the first guard grabbed his extended wrist, twisted it sharply behind his back, and slammed him face first onto the hood of his rented sedan. The metal crumpled slightly under Preston's weight as he let out a loud yelp of pain. The second guard stepped smoothly between me and Chloe, creating an impenetrable human wall. "Do not touch her!" the guard ordered, his voice booming with military authority. Chloe shrieked in absolute terror, jumping back and clutching her designer bag to her chest. Preston struggled against the hood of the car, demanding they let him go, threatening to sue the guards and the school. The commotion had drawn the attention of the school administration. The heavy oak double doors of the main building swung open. Headmaster Sterling, a distinguished man in a gray tailored suit, rushed out onto the courtyard. Chloe saw him, and her eyes lit up with desperate hope. She immediately went into her victim routine, pointing a trembling finger at me and the security guards. "Help us," Chloe cried out to the headmaster. "Call the police right now. This crazy woman just ordered her thugs to attack my husband. She is a criminal. Have her arrested." Headmaster Sterling jogged down the brick steps and walked briskly toward the drop-off zone. He did not look at Chloe. He did not look at Preston pinned against the hood of the rental car. He walked directly up to me, stopped at a respectful distance, adjusted his silk tie, and bowed his head in deep reverence. "Good morning, Madam Chairwoman of the Board Headmaster," Sterling said, his voice ringing out with absolute respect. "I apologize for this disturbance. Shall I have these trespassers permanently removed from the academy grounds?" Chloe's jaw physically dropped open. She stopped breathing entirely. Her eyes darted from Headmaster Sterling to the security guards and then finally rested on me. The color drained completely from her face, leaving her looking pale and terrified. Preston stopped struggling against the hood of the car, his neck craning awkwardly to look at the headmaster in sheer disbelief. "Yes, Headmaster Sterling," I replied, brushing a speck of dust off my emerald sleeve. "These two were just leaving. And please instruct the gate security that Chloe and Preston are permanently banned from coming within 500 feet of this campus." "Understood, Madam Chairwoman," he replied, stepping back respectfully. I looked down at Chloe, who was visibly trembling. Her entire reality was currently collapsing around her. "Have a terrible morning, Chloe," I said. "I will see you both in the boardroom." I did not even look back as my driver pulled away from the school courtyard. The image of Preston pinned against the hood of his cheap rental car by my security team was deeply satisfying. But I had a massive empire to run, and I could not waste my entire morning dealing with a fragile man throwing a temper tantrum. I tapped the privacy glass and told Marcus to take me directly to the Sovereign Tower. The Sovereign is the absolute crown jewel of the Atlanta skyline. It is a sleek 80-story high-rise of reinforced glass and steel that dominates the financial district. For the past 3 years, my family believed I rented a tiny studio apartment on one of the lowest floors of the building, struggling each month to scrape together the rent. They loved the idea of me living paycheck to paycheck surrounded by wealth I could never actually touch. They had absolutely no idea that my holding company Apex Holdings had purchased the entire residential and commercial tower in a massive private acquisition. I walked through the grand marble lobby, the heels of my stilettos clicking sharply against the polished stone. The concierge staff stood straight and offered respectful greetings as I passed. I headed straight for the executive management suite on the ground floor. David, the senior property manager, was waiting for me with a fresh double espresso and the quarterly financial reports stacked neatly on his mahogany desk. I sat down in the plush leather chair across from him, enjoying the quiet, luxurious hum of the building I owned. We were barely 10 minutes into reviewing the commercial lease renewals for the upcoming year when David's direct office line began to ring incessantly. He glanced at the caller ID, frowned, and looked up at me. He explained that it was a man named Preston, demanding to speak to the highest authority in the building regarding a severe and immediate legal emergency with one of the tenants. A slow, chilling smile spread across my face. I nodded and gestured for David to answer the call and put it directly on the speakerphone. Preston's voice immediately filled the spacious office. He was loud, aggressive, and dripping with unearned authority. He did not bother with a polite greeting. He simply demanded to know who was in charge and launched into a massive tirade about his own self-importance. He introduced himself as a senior partner at a top-tier financial firm, deliberately dropping the names of local politicians and wealthy real estate developers he claimed to play golf with every weekend. He was using his best Wall Street voice, the one he always used to intimidate people he viewed as the working class. He told David that he was calling as a concerned citizen and a man of significant wealth to report a highly dangerous tenant living in the building. Preston then proudly named me. He told the property manager that I was a completely unhinged and violent woman who had just orchestrated an organized attack against him at a prestigious private school. He spun a ridiculous dramatic narrative, claiming I was deeply involved in organized crime and that I was actively using illegally obtained funds to pay my rent at the Sovereign. "You have a criminal living in your building," David Preston barked through the high-definition speaker. "She is a college dropout with a long documented history of erratic behavior and financial instability. She is a direct threat to the safety of your legitimate, high-paying residents. I know the kind of elite clientele you cater to in that tower, and people like Nia bring down the property value of the entire block. You need to terminate her lease and physically remove her and her children from the premises by the end of the business day." Preston did not stop there. He leaned heavily into his fabricated white savior complex, painting himself as the long-suffering victim of my supposed incompetence. He told David that he had personally subsidized my pathetic life for years. He boasted about how he had paid my utility bills when I lived in a terrible neighborhood just to keep my kids from freezing to death in the winter. Hearing him say that out loud made my blood boil, but I kept my face perfectly still and took a calm sip of my espresso. The absolute truth was that years ago, my grandmother had mailed me a check to help with my heating bill during a particularly harsh winter. Preston had intercepted the mail at my parents' house, cashed the check himself, and then paid my bill from his own account just so he could hold it over my head. He had played the generous hero in front of my father while literally stealing from an elderly woman to buy my parents' admiration. David looked across the desk at me, his eyes wide with absolute shock at the sheer audacity and blatant racism of the man on the phone. I just gave David a slight wave of my hand, signaling him to let Preston keep talking. Preston, sensing silence on the other end of the line, assumed his intimidation tactics were working perfectly. He decided to use what he thought was his ultimate weapon: his money. "Look," David Preston said, his tone shifting from angry to conspiratorial. "I am a man of action, and I want this problem solved today. I do not want her allowed back up to her cheap little apartment." I know exactly how these corporate leases work. There is always a buyout clause or a penalty fee for immediate eviction. I'm going to give you my corporate black card number right now. I want you to charge whatever penalty fee is required to break her lease immediately. I will personally pay out of my own pocket to have her thrown out on the street. Consider it a generous favor from me to your management company." Preston arrogantly read off a string of 16 digits followed by the expiration date and the security code. He was so incredibly confident in his privilege, so certain that his deep voice and his corporate buzzwords could erase my existence with a single phone call. He genuinely believed that his fake wealth gave him the power to render a black woman homeless, just because she had bruised his fragile ego earlier that morning. I gave David a firm nod. David turned to his computer and typed the numbers into his billing terminal. We waited in total silence for a few seconds. The screen flashed bright red with a bold error message. David cleared his throat, his professional tone completely masking the intense satisfaction hanging heavy in the room. He leaned closer to the speakerphone. "Mr. Preston?" David said smoothly. "I have processed the card number you provided. Unfortunately, it has been declined due to a severe freeze on all your associated corporate and personal accounts." Preston let out a loud, confused noise on the other end of the line. "That is impossible," he stammered, his confident facade instantly cracking. "Try it again. The system must be down. I have millions in that account. Just bypass the block and run it again manually." "I am afraid I cannot do that," Sir David replied, remaining perfectly calm. "And furthermore, I must inform you that I cannot process any eviction or lease termination against Ms. Nia. In fact, nobody in this city can evict her from this property." "What are you talking about?" Preston yelled, his voice pitching upward in sheer panic. "You are just a property manager. I will call the building owner directly. I will have you fired for incompetence before lunch. Give me the owner's name right now." David looked at me and I set my espresso cup down on the glass table. I leaned forward toward the speakerphone so Preston could hear every single syllable with crystal clarity. "You do not need to call the owner, Preston," I said, my voice echoing cleanly in the quiet office. "You are already speaking to her." Dead silence filled the phone line. I could practically hear Preston's brain short-circuiting as he tried to process the sound of my voice coming from the management office of the most expensive building in Atlanta. "Nia," he choked out, sounding like the air had been violently punched out of his lungs. "Sorry, Mr. Preston." David interjected, delivering the final blow with absolute precision. "We cannot evict Miss Nia, because her holding company Apex Holdings is the sole owner of this entire tower. Also, your credit card was just declined. Have a wonderful day." David reached over and pressed the disconnect button. The call ended abruptly, cutting off Preston's panicked gasp. I leaned back in my leather chair, crossing my legs, as a genuine smile finally broke across my face. The satisfaction of that phone call lingered in my office long after the line went dead. David stared at me with newfound reverence, but I simply instructed him to proceed with the next phase of our acquisitions. Preston was officially cornered. His credit lines were frozen, his real estate assets were locked, and his firm was bleeding cash by the hour. But men like Preston and women like my sister Chloe do not retreat when they are exposed. They double down on the illusion. They construct a smokescreen. Less than 48 hours later, the elegant gold-embossed invitations began circulating among Atlanta elite. It was an emergency save-face operation disguised as philanthropy. The Blackwood Foundation annual charity gala to be held at the Grand Ballroom of the Four Seasons Hotel. It was a desperate theatrical play. Preston was throwing a lavish party. He could not afford to project an image of absolute solvency, hoping to court private investors who might blindly bail him out of the massive financial hole he had dug. He was hunting for a silent partner, and he had set his sights on the mysterious holding company that was rapidly dominating the city commercial sector. He had no idea that Apex Holdings was actively hunting him. My mother called me the morning of the gala. She did not call to see how Jamal and Maya were doing. She did not call to apologize for the scene at the restaurant or the school. She called to issue a mandate. "Nia, I am calling to make something abundantly clear," my mother said, her voice tight with anxiety and classist superiority. "Preston and Chloe are hosting a very important charity event tonight at the Four Seasons. The mayor will be there. Several bank presidents will be there. I know you sometimes take your kids walking around downtown on the weekends, but I need you to stay away from the hotel district tonight." I sat at my kitchen island reviewing a digital contract on my tablet. Is that so? I asked, keeping my tone mild. Yes, it is, she snapped. Tickets are $1,000 a plate. It is an exclusive, highly curated environment. Frankly, Nia, you are socially unfit for a room like that. Your entire presence is a liability. Preston is under an immense amount of pressure, closing a massive corporate partnership tonight, and the last thing he needs is you showing up in your cheap clothes looking for a handout and polluting the atmosphere. We need this night to be visually and socially flawless. Do you understand me? I understand you perfectly, Mom, I replied, my voice devoid of any emotion. I promise you, I will not be buying $1,000 ticket. Good, she sighed, sounding immensely relieved. Stay in the West End where you belong. I disconnected the call and immediately dialed my chief financial officer. The instructions I gave were precise and absolute. I authorized a $50,000 wire transfer directly to the Blackwood Foundation. I instructed him to purchase the Diamond Sponsor VIP table under the name Apex Holdings and to ensure the transaction remained strictly anonymous until the exact moment the Master of Ceremonies read the donor list. That evening I did not dress like a struggling graphic designer. I dressed like the predator my family had forced me to become. I wore a custom-tailored midnight blue evening gown that swept the floor with a dangerous elegance. The fabric was pure silk, contouring perfectly to my frame. I paired it with a single diamond necklace that cost more than my parents' suburban home. My makeup was flawless, my hair was pulled back into a severe, sleek bun, and my demeanor was absolute ice. Marcus drove the Maybach smoothly up to the valet stand at the Four Seasons. I bypassed the crowded general admission line, where local socialites were eagerly posing for photographs. The event manager, recognizing my name immediately from the top of the VIP manifest, personally escorted me through the private side entrance. The grand ballroom was a spectacle of desperate extravagance. Crystal chandeliers bathed the room in golden light, while waiters circulated with silver trays of imported champagne. I was led directly to the very front of the room. The Diamond Sponsor table was roped off with velvet cords situated right beside the main stage. It was the best seat in the house, offering a perfect vantage point of the entire charade. I sat down alone, sipping sparkling water, and watched my family perform. Chloe was working this room in a sequined gown she had undoubtedly purchased on a high-interest credit card. She was laughing too loudly, tossing her hair and clinging to the arms of wealthy wives who secretly despised her. Preston was sweating through his expensive tuxedo. He was moving from group to group, shaking hands with aggressive desperation, his eyes constantly darting toward the entrance. He was waiting for his savior. He had been boasting all week that the CEO of Apex Holdings was attending his gala, heavily implying that a massive corporate merger was imminent. He truly believed that this faceless billionaire was going to walk through the doors, shake his hand, and write a check that would make his legal troubles disappear. My parents were hovering near the buffet, beaming with ignorant pride. They looked like royalty presiding over a kingdom built on quicksand. It took 30 minutes for Chloe to finally notice me. She was walking toward the front of the stage with a glass of champagne when she stopped dead in her tracks. The blood drained from her face. She blinked rapidly as if her eyes were playing tricks on her. When she realized it was actually me sitting calmly at the most expensive table in the ballroom, her shock instantly morphed into pure, unadulterated rage. She marched over to my table, her heels stomping aggressively against the plush carpet. She bypassed the velvet rope and leaned over my table, her face contorted with malice. "What the hell are you doing here?" Chloe hissed, her voice a venomous whisper, so the surrounding tables would not hear. "How did you get in here? Did you sneak in through the kitchen? Are you out of your mind?" "I am simply enjoying the ambiance, Chloe," I replied, taking a slow sip of my water. "It is a lovely party. You must be drowning in debt to afford it." "Get out!" she demanded, slamming her manicured hand onto my table. "Get out right now before I call security and have you physically dragged into the street. You do not belong here. This table is reserved for the CEO of Apex Holdings. They are our diamond sponsor. If they walk in and see trash like you sitting at their private table, Preston will lose his biggest investment." My mother, having spotted the commotion, hurried over. When she saw me sitting at the VIP table, she actually gasped, clutching her chest in horror. "Nia," my mother scolded, her voice trembling with furious panic. "I specifically told you to stay away. You are humiliating us. You are trying to sabotage your sister on the most important night of her life. Get up and leave this instant before Preston sees you." I did not move a single muscle. I just looked at the two women who had spent my entire life trying to make me feel small. "I am not going anywhere," I said, my voice perfectly calm and laced with absolute authority. "I paid for this seat." "You do not have $1,000. Chloe spat a cruel laugh escaping her lips. You are a broke single mother who leeches off this family. Security will be here in exactly 10 seconds to remove you. Before Chloe could wave down the guards, the grand ballroom lights suddenly dimmed. A hush fell over the glittering crowd as the spotlight hit the center stage. The master of ceremonies, a local television anchor, stepped up to the microphone, tapping it gently to command the room attention. Chloe instantly panicked. She hissed at me to hide my face and rushed back toward the side of the stage where Preston was already standing. Preston was buttoning his suit jacket, straightening his tie, and wearing a smile of absolute arrogant triumph. He was ready for his coronation. Ladies and gentlemen, the MC announced, his voice booming through the speakers. Tonight is about generosity, it is about community, and it is about recognizing the incredible leaders who elevate our city. We have many generous donors tonight, but there is one contributor who stands far above the rest. Preston puffed out his chest, preparing to walk forward and bask in the applause. He looked around the room, soaking in the admiration of the Atlanta elite. This organization made an anonymous diamond tier donation of $50,000 today to secure the premier VIP table. The MC continued reading enthusiastically from his cue card. We are incredibly honored to have them in the room with us tonight. Please put your hands together and give a massive, Four Seasons welcome to the anonymous donor, the driving force behind Atlanta new commercial skyline, the founder and CEO of Apex Holdings. The crowd erupted into massive applause. Preston stepped forward, clapping his hands, his eyes scanning the back of the room, waiting for an older, wealthy white man to walk down the center aisle and save his fraudulent company. He was ready to extend his hand. He was ready to seal the deal. But nobody walked down the aisle. Instead, the heavy spotlight swung sharply away from the entrance. It swept across the dark ballroom, illuminating the glittering chandeliers and the shocked faces of the elite guests. The bright beam of light moved directly to the very front of the room. It stopped dead on the roped-off VIP table. It stopped dead on me. I stood up slowly, bathed in the blinding white light of the spotlight. The custom midnight blue silk of my gown shimmered as I stepped out from behind the table. I did not look at the crowd. I looked directly at the side of the stage. Preston's smile vanished instantly. His arms dropped heavily to his sides. His jaw went completely slack as his eyes locked onto mine. The absolute horror, the sheer devastating realization washing over his face was a masterpiece. He looked from me to the MC and back to me, his brain violently rejecting the reality standing right in front of him. Chloe let out a loud, audible gasp that echoed through the front row. She stumbled backward, grabbing Preston's arm to steady herself, her eyes wide with a terror I had never seen before. My mother stood frozen near the buffet table, looking as if she had just seen a ghost. I stood in the spotlight, looking at the man who had publicly degraded my son, looking at the sister who had stolen my work, looking at the family who had called me a failure. I raised my glass of sparkling water toward the stage, looking directly into Preston's terrified eyes. The silence in my office was absolute perfection. I instructed David to block any further communications from Preston and return to my work. The trap I had laid was flawless, and the jaws were rapidly snapping shut around my sister and her arrogant husband. 24 hours later, the shockwaves of my financial strike were systematically dismantling Preston World. But Chloe operated on the delusion that if you ignore a massive fire long enough, it will simply burn itself out. Her entire identity was tied to the illusion of infinite wealth, and she was desperate to prove to herself and her circle that nothing was wrong. This staggering denial brought her to the sanctuary. The sanctuary was the most exclusive, overpriced luxury spa in the heart of Buckhead. It was a place where Atlanta elite gathered to drink imported champagne in plush white robes and pretend their lives were perfect. I knew Chloe would be there. It was her standing Friday appointment with her inner circle of wealthy socialites. These were 3 prominent African-American women whose husbands controlled local politics and commercial development. Chloe spent her entire life trying to impress them, trying to secure her position at the top of a social ladder she could not actually afford to climb. I arrived at the spa an hour after Chloe. I bypassed the main reception area and took the private elevator reserved exclusively for Black Diamond members. The air smelled of eucalyptus and expensive lavender oil. I wore a custom-tailored cream silk lounge set and oversized designer sunglasses, projecting an aura of effortless, untouchable wealth. I did not rush. I simply stepped off the elevator and walked smoothly toward the grand marble checkout counter where the final act of Chloe morning was about to begin. Chloe was standing at the front desk flanked by her 3 socialite friends. They were laughing, sipping cucumber water, and discussing an upcoming charity gala. Chloe was playing the role of the generous, wealthy benefactor perfectly. She waved her hand dismissively at her friends and insisted on covering the entire bill for their morning of massages and facial treatments. She wanted to show them that $3,000 was nothing but pocket change to her. I stood discreetly near a display of luxury skincare products, just out of her direct line of sight, and watched the performance unfold. "Put it all on my tab," Chloe told the receptionist, her voice carrying that familiar tone of arrogant superiority. "And add a 20% gratuity for the massage therapists. They did an adequate job today." The receptionist, a young woman with a tight professional smile, took the sleek metal credit card from Chloe's hand. She swiped it through the terminal. The machine let out a sharp, aggressive beep. The screen flashed bright red. "I am sorry, Mrs. Blackwood," the receptionist said, keeping her voice low. "This card has been declined." Chloe let out a dramatic scoff, rolling her eyes for the benefit of her friends. "It is probably a fraud alert," she lied smoothly. "Preston makes so many massive international transactions that the bank freezes the accounts out of an abundance of caution. It is honestly exhausting dealing with this level of wealth. Here, try my platinum card." She dug into her designer handbag and produced a second card. The receptionist swiped it. Beep. Declined. The easy smiles on the faces of Chloe's friends began to slip. The air around the marble counter grew incredibly tense. "That is impossible!" Chloe snapped, her voice pitching upward in panic. "Run it again. You are clearly doing something wrong with the machine." "I assure you, ma'am, the machine is working perfectly," the receptionist replied, her polite tone wavering slightly. "Do you have another form of payment?" Chloe's hands started to shake. She frantically pulled out a third card. It was a joint account card she rarely used. Declined. She pulled out a fourth card, an emergency line of credit. Declined. She pulled out a fifth card, a store-specific credit card that could not even be used at a spa. She was completely unraveling. "The total is $3,200, Mrs. Blackwood," the receptionist said, staring directly at the pile of useless plastic on the counter. "We need to settle this balance immediately." Chloe's friends exchanged a very long, very uncomfortable look. The illusion of the wealthy, successful sister was shattering right in front of the very people she worshipped. One of the women stepped back slightly, physically distancing herself from the profound embarrassment radiating from the front desk. Chloe's face was turning a deep shade of crimson. She was hyperventilating, digging through her bag looking for cash she did not have. I decided she had suffered just enough in private. It was time to make it public. I walked smoothly across the polished marble floor. The spa manager, seeing me approach, immediately rushed out from the back office, completely ignoring the chaotic scene at the main register. "Good morning, Miss Nia," the manager said, bowing her head respectfully. "Your private suite is prepared. Shall we send up your usual complimentary champagne?" The sound of my name made Chloe freeze. She snapped her head toward me, her eyes wide with absolute horror. Her three friends stared at me in total confusion. They recognized me from the miserable stories Chloe had spun over the years. They knew me as the struggling single mother, the family disappointment, the college dropout who lived in poverty. Seeing me standing there dripping in wealth and being treated like absolute royalty by the spa manager broke their brains. "Good morning, Sandra," I replied, smiling warmly at the manager. "I will take the champagne in a moment. First, I need to settle a minor issue here." I stepped directly up to the counter, standing shoulder to shoulder with my trembling sister. I looked down at the pathetic pile of declined credit cards and then looked up into Chloe's panicked eyes. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with a gentle, chilling sweetness that echoed beautifully in the quiet lobby. "If things are that tight right now, Chloe, you really should have just asked me for help," I said, ensuring her friends heard every single word. "There is no need to embarrass yourself in public like this. I can cover your little spa day. After all, you always did have a habit of taking my discarded leftovers, did you not?" The reference to the graphic design portfolio she stole from me 7 years ago hung heavily in the air. The words sliced right through her pride. Her friends gasped audibly, stepping even further away from her. The humiliation was absolute. It was suffocating. I reached into my bag, pulled out my solid black corporate card, and handed it to the receptionist. "Put Mrs. Blackwood entire balance on my account," I instructed. "And please process my usual Black Diamond membership renewal while you are at it." The receptionist nodded eagerly, processing the payment in less than 3 seconds. The machine chimed a cheerful approval. Chloe could not speak. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. She was drowning in a sea of public shame. She looked at her friends, hoping for some semblance of support or solidarity, but they were looking at her with pure, unadulterated pity. They were looking at her the exact same way she had always looked at me. It was the ultimate social death sentence. Without saying a single word, Chloe grabbed her bags, spun around, and bolted toward the spa exit. She practically ran through the sliding glass doors, desperate to escape the crushing reality of her own poverty. I stood at the counter, retrieved my receipt, and smiled at the three socialites who were still standing frozen in shock. "Have a wonderful afternoon, ladies," I said smoothly, before turning and following the manager toward my private suite. Outside the spa, Chloe was completely losing her mind. She stood on the sun-baked sidewalk of Buckhead, her chest heaving as she frantically dialed Preston's number. She paced back and forth, ignoring the curious stares of pedestrians. Her perfect life was burning to the ground, and she needed someone to fix it. Preston answered on the second ring. He did not sound like the arrogant master of the universe anymore. He sounded like a cornered rat. "Preston, you have to do something!" Chloe screamed into the phone, tears of pure rage streaming down her face. "My cards are completely frozen, every single one of them. Nia just humiliated me in front of everyone at the spa. She paid my bill. She treated me like a beggar. You need to call the bank and stop this right now." "Chloe, shut up!" Preston roared through the speaker, his voice cracking with absolute desperation. "The cards are the least of our problems right now. The holding company just executed the collateral clause on our personal assets." "What does that mean?" Chloe demanded, her voice trembling. "It means you need to get an Uber and come home right now," Preston yelled, breathing heavily. "Because the repo trucks are sitting in our driveway. I am standing here watching two men hook chains up to your Maserati. They are dragging it away, Chloe. They are taking everything." I did not stay to watch the rest of Chloe's public meltdown. I stepped out of the luxury spa, the cool air-conditioned lobby fading behind me as I slid into the quiet leather interior of my waiting Maybach. I instructed Marcus to drive me back to my office at the Sovereign Tower. The serene quiet of the car was a stark contrast to the absolute chaos I had just unleashed on my sister. I knew the towing of her Maserati and the declining of her credit cards were only the first dominoes to fall in a very long line of financial ruin. Preston's entire house of cards was collapsing in real time, and it was only a matter of hours before the panic infected the rest of my family. I pulled out my tablet to review a commercial lease agreement, fully prepared to move on with my day. I barely had time to read the first paragraph when my phone screen illuminated with an incoming call from my father. I watched his name flash across the screen and let it ring until it went to voicemail. 30 seconds later, a text message appeared from my mother. It was written in frantic, aggressive all caps, demanding I come to their house immediately. It was not a request. It was a royal summons. She claimed it was a life-or-death family emergency, and that I was required to drop whatever meaningless tasks I was doing and report to them at once. I looked at the message and felt a familiar twist in my gut, but this time there was no anxiety. There was no fear of their judgment. There was only a profound sense of closure. The final act of this tragedy was calling, and I was ready to deliver the ending they had earned. I tapped the glass partition and told Marcus to turn the car around and head toward the affluent suburb where I had grown up. The drive took 40 minutes, winding through manicured, tree-lined streets that reeked of old money and desperate social climbing. We pulled up to the large colonial-style house with its imposing white columns and perfectly landscaped lawn. This was the house where I had been conditioned to believe I was inferior. This was the house where every accomplishment of mine was minimized to make room for Chloe's ego. This was the house I had been thrown out of for getting pregnant with Jamal, labeled a permanent embarrassment to their pristine reputation. I stepped out of the car clutching a slim custom leather folder containing documents my legal team had meticulously compiled over the last month. The front door was slightly ajar, indicating the sheer panic occurring inside. I pushed it open and walked slowly into the grand marble foyer. The atmosphere inside the house was suffocatingly tense, thick with the scent of fear and desperation. My parents were pacing the living room like caged animals. Chloe was collapsed on the expensive white linen sofa, sobbing uncontrollably into her hands. Her designer wig was still askew. Her makeup was smeared down her cheeks, and she looked completely stripped of her usual arrogant armor. The woman who had tried to humiliate me at the spa just an hour ago was now a broken, weeping mess. Preston was pacing frantically near the stone fireplace, running his hands nervously through his thinning hair and aggressively chewing on his thumbnail. He looked like a man who knew the executioner was walking up the steps. When my father saw me enter, he immediately stopped pacing and pointed a trembling, demanding finger at me. "Get in here, Nia," my father barked, his voice laced with pure, unfiltered panic. "Preston is the victim of a massive banking error and a targeted corporate attack. The bank has temporarily frozen his assets pending a ridiculous federal investigation. They took Chloe's car right out of our driveway. They are trying to freeze all their accounts. We need liquidity immediately to hire the best defense attorneys in Atlanta and keep Preston business operations afloat until this massive misunderstanding is resolved. I stood in the doorway calmly observing the pathetic scene unfolding in front of me. And exactly how does this financial disaster concern me, I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. My mother marched forward, her face twisted with a mixture of desperation and furious entitlement. She pointed her manicured finger directly at my chest. It concerns you, because you are going to help your family, she demanded, her voice shrill. You are going to go to whatever loan sharks or shady payday lenders you use in that terrible neighborhood of yours, and you are going to take out a high-interest cash loan. We need $50,000 in cash by the end of the day. You will pawn whatever fake jewelry you have. You will sell your cheap car. Preston needs this bridge loan right now to save his reputation and protect our family name. I stared at her, letting the absolute absurdity of her demand wash over the room. You want me to take out a predatory loan to fund Preston legal defense? I asked, my voice dangerously calm and quiet. You want me to go into crippling debt for a man who publicly degraded my son last night? My mother completely lost what little composure she had left. Yes, she screamed, her voice echoing violently off the high ceilings of the living room. You owe this to us. Look at him, Nia. He is a white man. He is educated. He is a financial genius with a brilliant corporate mind. He will bounce back from this temporary setback because he has the pedigree to survive. He is the pride of this family. And what are you? You are just a useless black girl who dropped out of college and ruined her life. You have no future and no reputation to protect. If you ruin your credit, it does not matter because you are already a complete failure. Preston is our only hope for maintaining our status in this city. You will do this for him because you are meant to serve the success of this family. The sheer racist and classist venom in her words was breathtaking. For 32 years, I had allowed this woman to dictate my worth. I had allowed her to convince me that my skin color, my gender, and my circumstances made me inherently less valuable than a mediocre man with a polished resume and a fake smile. She truly believed that my entire existence was meant to be sacrificed on the altar of Preston privilege. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not try to defend my humanity. Emotional reactions were exactly what she wanted to feed her sense of superiority. I simply walked over to the heavy mahogany coffee table and dropped the slim leather folder onto the glass surface. The sharp slap of the leather against the glass made Preston flinch. You are incredibly eager to sacrifice my life and my children's future for a man you do not even know, I said, my voice slicing through the room like a cold steel scalpel. You think Preston is a financial genius. You think he is a wealthy elite who elevates this family to the upper echelons of Atlanta society. You have spent years worshipping his race and his supposed bank accounts while looking down on your own flesh and blood. I opened the folder and spread the official bank statements, legal contracts, and property deeds across the table. Look at these papers, Mom. Look closely at the brilliant white genius you are defending so passionately. My father stepped forward, his brow furrowed as he looked down at the highlighted documents bearing official government seals. What is this garbage, he demanded, trying to maintain his authoritative tone. These are the authenticated financial records of Preston Shell Companies, I explained, keeping my gaze locked on my father. Preston is not a master of Wall Street. He is a glorified con artist who has been running a massive Ponzi scheme for the last 3 years. His entire portfolio is built on fraudulent commercial loans, fabricated assets, and stolen funds. And do you know how he managed to secure his absolute last round of desperate funding when the banks finally cut him off? He used you. Preston stopped pacing, his face drained of all color, turning a sickly shade of gray. He took a step backward toward the hallway, looking like a trapped animal calculating his escape route. Chloe stopped crying and stared at me, her eyes wide with total confusion, as she looked from the papers to her husband. What are you talking about? My mother gasped, looking from me to the documents spread across the table. Her eyes caught her own signature at the bottom of a page. 6 months ago, Preston convinced you to sign a thick stack of legal documents, I said, tapping my manicured nail against the specific page bearing my parents' signatures. He told you it was routine partnership paperwork to make you silent investors in his massive new commercial development downtown. He promised you a massive return on your investment that would secure your retirement, but you never read the fine print, did you? You trusted him implicitly because he wore a nice tailored suit and spoke with unearned, arrogant confidence. He tricked you into signing a second mortgage on this exact house. He secretly leveraged the entire equity of your home to secure a $2 million cash loan to illegally fund his failing ghost company. The money is completely gone, and you are holding the debt. My mother stumbled back, falling heavily into an armchair. That is a lie, she whispered, shaking her head violently, refusing to process the words. Preston would never do that to us. He loves us. He is protecting our legacy. You are lying, Naya. You are just a jealous, bitter liar trying to tear down a successful man because you hate your own miserable life. My father slammed his heavy hand on the glass table, rattling the framed photos sitting on top. She is right, he shouted, his face red with denial. You fabricated these documents to cause trouble. You probably printed these off the internet. Preston is a respectable businessman. You are just trying to ruin your sister's marriage out of pure spite because you are alone. Get out of my house right now. I looked at them, trapped in their absolute delusion. They were still choosing to protect the man who had just destroyed their lives, rather than listen to the daughter, who was holding the literal proof of their ruin. They were so desperate to cling to their illusion of high society status that they were willing to go down with a sinking ship as long as it had a first-class deck. Before I could tell them that their blind loyalty had literally cost them everything they owned. A loud, heavy knock echoed through the quiet house. The heavy brass knocker against the solid oak front door struck 3 times with absolute, unquestionable authority. My father glared at me, chest heaving, before turning and marching toward the grand foyer. He pulled open the heavy front door, clearly preparing to yell at whoever was interrupting our family crisis, but the angry words died instantly in his throat. Standing on the front porch, flanked by 2 armed and uniformed county deputies, was the local sheriff. He was holding a thick stack of yellow legal papers securely attached to a metal clipboard. He did not look amused. "Are you Vernon and Brenda?" The sheriff asked, his voice carrying the heavy, uncompromising weight of the law. "I am here to serve an official notice of foreclosure and immediate eviction. The bank has seized this property due to severe loan default. You have exactly 1 hour to vacate the premises." The heavy silence in the living room shattered into a million jagged pieces. My father physically recoiled from the sheriff as if he had been struck. He reached out with trembling hands to take the bright yellow eviction notice, staring at the bold black letters that signaled the end of his meticulously curated life. My mother let out a sound that was half gasp and half scream. She collapsed back into her armchair, clutching the fabric of her expensive blouse as she struggled to pull air into her lungs. "This is a mistake," my father stammered, his voice completely devoid of its usual booming authority. "I have lived in this house for 25 years. The mortgage is paid off. You cannot throw us out on the street like common criminals. Let me call my attorney." "You are welcome to call whoever you like, sir," the sheriff replied, his tone remaining strictly professional and entirely unmoved. "But the bank legally seized this property at 9 o'clock this morning. The secondary loan secured against this deed has been in default for 90 days. My deputies will wait outside. You have 60 minutes to gather your essential belongings and medications before we secure the doors." The sheriff turned on his heel and walked out, the heavy front door clicking shut behind him with an awful finality. The reality of the situation crashed down on my parents with devastating force. My mother turned her wild, panicked eyes toward Preston, who had backed himself into the furthest corner of the living room. He looked like a rat searching for a crack in the baseboards. Chloe was frozen, her mouth hanging open, unable to comprehend that her lavish lifestyle had just rendered her parents completely homeless. I calmly reached across the glass coffee table and gathered my documents. I slid the bank statements and the foreclosure records back into my sleek leather folder. I looked at the 3 of them drowning in the exact same toxic waters they had tried to drown me in my entire life. "I told you Preston was a parasite," I said, my voice steady and completely void of sympathy. "You chose to value his skin color and his fabricated resume over your own daughter. You chose to protect his ego while he systematically stole your future. You have 58 minutes left. I suggest you start packing." I turned and walked out the front door. The sound of my mother bursting into hysterical wailing echoed behind me, but I did not look back. I stepped into my waiting car and told Marcus to take me home. The air felt incredibly light. I expected absolute radio silence from Preston after that night. I expected him to flee the city or hide behind a wall of cheap defense attorneys. But a cornered narcissist is a remarkably predictable creature. They always believe they can talk their way out of the trap. The next afternoon, I was sitting in my executive office at the Sovereign Tower, reviewing the final liquidation schedules for Preston Firm. My private cell phone vibrated on the desk. It was an unknown number. I let it ring for a few seconds before answering. "Nia, please do not hang up." It was Preston. His voice was hushed, breathless, and completely stripped of the booming corporate arrogance he had wielded like a weapon for the last 5 years. He sounded like a man standing on the edge of a very high cliff. "Make it quick, Preston," I replied, leaning back in my chair and looking out over the Atlanta skyline. "I need to see you," he pleaded, his words tumbling over each other in a desperate rush. "Just you and me. No lawyers, no family, just 15 minutes of your time." "Please, Naya, it is a matter of life and death. I know I have made mistakes, but I have a proposition for you. Something that will make you incredibly wealthy. We need to meet somewhere private." I smiled a slow, chilling smile. I told him to meet me at a rundown diner on the industrial edge of the city, a place where nobody wearing a tailored suit would ever be caught dead. When I walked into the diner an hour later, the contrast between us was almost comical. I was wearing a pristine, white-tailored blazer and carrying a Birkin bag. Preston was sitting in a sticky vinyl booth in the darkest corner of the restaurant. He looked utterly destroyed. He was unshaven, his eyes were bloodshot, and his clothes looked like he had slept in them for days. He jumped when I slid into the booth across from him. "Thank you for coming," he whispered, glancing nervously over his shoulder, as if he expected federal agents to walk through the door at any second. "You have exactly 14 minutes left," I said, placing my phone face down on the table. "Speak." Preston leaned forward, resting his elbows on the chipped formica table. He looked at me with pathetic, pleading eyes. "Nia, I know you have powerful connections. You sitting at that diamond sponsor table last night, you having access to those confidential banking records. You clearly know someone very high up at Apex Holdings. You might even be sleeping with one of the executives. I do not care how you know them, but I know you have their ear." He genuinely believed I was just a messenger. His fragile ego still absolutely refused to entertain the idea that a black woman he had repeatedly called a failure could be the mastermind behind his destruction. He needed to believe a powerful man was pulling the strings for me. "What exactly is your proposition, Preston?" I asked, keeping my face perfectly still. He swallowed hard, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. "Chloe is a monster, Nia. She is greedy, she is toxic, and she forced me into this. She demanded the luxury cars, the spa days, the country club memberships. She drained my accounts dry. I only took out those loans to keep her happy. She is a parasite." I watched in mild fascination as he threw his wife under the bus without a single second of hesitation. He was willing to sacrifice the woman who had worshipped him just to save his own skin. "I am leaving her," Preston continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I am filing for divorce the minute the banks unfreeze my accounts. I am cutting her and your parents completely out of my life. But I need you to talk to your connection at Apex. I need you to beg them to release the hold on my commercial assets. If they back off and give me 60 days, I can restructure the debt. If you do this for me, Nia, I will give you 20% of my firm, 20% of every deal I close for the rest of my life. You will never have to worry about money again. You can finally move out of whatever terrible neighborhood you live in." He sat back, breathing heavily, looking incredibly proud of himself. He honestly thought he was throwing me a lifeline. He thought he was the savior offering me a golden ticket. I looked at him for a long, silent moment. I slowly picked up my phone from the table. I tapped the screen and stopped the voice recording app that had been running since the moment I sat down. I quickly attached the audio file to an email and sent it directly to Chloe, my mother, and my father. "You sent that to your Apex connection?" Preston asked, his eyes lighting up with desperate hope. "No," I said, slipping my phone back into my bag. "I just sent an audio recording of this entire conversation to your wife and your in-laws. I figured they should hear exactly how quickly you were willing to trade them for a 20% equity deal." Preston's face went completely blank. His jaw dropped, and a sound resembling a strangled gasp escaped his throat. "Why would you do that?" He choked out, his hands beginning to tremble violently. "You just ruined my marriage. You just threw away your only chance at real money." I leaned across the sticky diner table, closing the distance between us until he had nowhere to look but directly into my eyes. "You still do not understand, do you, Preston?" I whispered, my voice dripping with absolute lethal finality. "You are still looking for the man behind the curtain. You are still hoping that someone else is pulling the strings, because the alternative is simply too devastating for your pathetic ego to accept." I watched his pupils dilate as the terrible, chilling truth finally began to dawn on him. "I do not know anyone at Apex Holdings, Preston. I do not sleep with the executives. I do not run errands for the board." I paused, letting the silence stretch out until it was suffocating. "I am Apex. I am the CEO. I am the sole owner. It was my money that bought your building. It was my legal team that seized your assets. It was my signature that evicted my parents from their home today. And I am the one who is going to watch you go to federal prison. Preston physically collapsed. The air rushed out of his lungs in a sharp wheezing sound. He slid downward in the vinyl booth, his hands gripping his hair as the absolute magnitude of his destruction crushed him. He was completely broken, utterly defeated by the very woman he had sworn was beneath him. I stood up, dropped a $5 bill on the table for my coffee, and walked out the door, leaving him to drown in the wreckage of his own making. The morning sun reflected harshly off the towering glass facade of the corporate building that housed Preston Firm. It was a monolith of steel and illusion built on the backs of defrauded investors and predatory lending. Today, that illusion was going to be shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Preston had called an emergency shareholder meeting, a desperate final attempt to pacify his furious financial backers and explain away the sudden freezing of his assets. I knew my parents and Chloe would be there. They had to be. After I exposed Preston's massive Ponzi scheme and revealed that he had secretly mortgaged my parents' house to cover his failing ghost company, they had no choice. They were now his largest and most vulnerable creditors. They were clinging to the microscopic hope that Preston could stand in front of that boardroom and pull a miraculous financial rabbit out of his tailored hat. They were utterly delusional. I stepped out of the back of my Maybach and smoothed the crisp fabric of my clothing. I had specifically chosen my wardrobe for this execution. I wore a stark white Alexander McQueen tailored suit. The sharp structured shoulders and the perfectly draped wide-leg trousers felt like a suit of modern armor. It projected absolute unyielding power. On my feet I wore a pair of towering Christian Louboutin stilettos, the signature red soles clicking with lethal precision against the concrete pavement. My hair was pulled back into a severe flawless style and my makeup was immaculate. I did not look like the scapegoat daughter they had thrown away. I looked like the apex predator who had come to collect her due. I was not walking into the slaughter alone. Trailing exactly one step behind me in a perfect V formation was my elite legal strike team. 5 of the most ruthless and expensive corporate attorneys in the state of Georgia. They wore immaculate dark charcoal suits and carried heavy leather briefcases packed with the very documents that spelled the absolute end of Preston existence. We moved through the expansive marble lobby of the building with the synchronized precision of a military unit. The front desk security guards did not even attempt to stop us. My lead attorney simply flashed a federal injunction and a stack of corporate takeover documents, and the guards immediately stepped aside, lowering their eyes. We rode the private executive elevator to the penthouse floor in total silence. The door slid open to reveal a sprawling reception area completely abandoned by the administrative staff who had clearly sensed the impending doom. Ahead of us were the heavy double mahogany doors of the primary executive boardroom. I could hear the muffled sounds of shouting filtering through the thick wood. The investors were already tearing Preston apart. I did not knock. I placed my palms flat against the heavy mahogany and pushed the doors violently open. They slammed against the interior walls with a deafening crack that echoed like a gunshot. The shouting inside the boardroom ceased instantly. The silence that followed was so profound, it felt like all the oxygen had been instantly sucked out of the room. I stepped over the threshold, the red soles of my Louboutins sinking into the plush corporate carpet. My 5 attorneys fanned out seamlessly behind me, creating an impenetrable wall of legal authority. I slowly surveyed the room. The long mahogany table was surrounded by a dozen furious wealthy investors, their faces red with rage and panic. At the head of the table, Preston was standing frozen. He was sweating profusely, his expensive suit jacket discarded, his tie loosened, and his eyes wide with absolute sheer terror. He looked like a man standing on the gallows watching the executioner walk up the steps. Sitting in the plush chairs against the far wall were my mother, my father, and my sister. Chloe was wearing massive dark sunglasses indoors, desperately trying to hide her swollen, bloodshot eyes from the previous day revelations. She was visibly trembling, clutching a designer handbag to her chest, like a flotation device. My mother looked pale and gaunt, staring at me with a mixture of profound confusion and rising panic. But it was my father who reacted first. His lifelong conditioning, his absolute refusal to see me as anything other than a useless failure, instantly overrode his common sense. He could not process the image of his discarded daughter, standing in a room full of elite corporate players, radiating more power and wealth than anyone else in the building. His fragile ego snapped. He pushed himself out of his chair, his face twisting into an ugly mask of toxic authority and condescending rage. "What the hell kind of sick stunt are you pulling now, Nia?" My father shouted, his booming voice shattering the quiet of the boardroom. He marched directly toward me, pointing a trembling, furious finger at my face. The wealthy shareholders sitting at the table watched the exchange in stunned bewilderment. "How did you even get past the security desk downstairs?" my father demanded, closing the distance between us. "This is a closed-door emergency meeting for billionaires and elite investors. We are dealing with a massive corporate crisis, and the last thing we need is you bringing your ghetto dramatic nonsense into this building. You have absolutely no business being here. You are just an ugly, uneducated college dropout looking for a handout. Get out of this room right now before I personally call the police and have you dragged out in handcuffs for trespassing." He stopped just 3 feet in front of me, his chest heaving, his face purple with absolute fury. He was trying to protect Preston. He was trying to protect the illusion of the wealthy white savior who was supposedly going to rescue their family from the foreclosure notice I had delivered yesterday. He was trying to assert his dominance over the black sheep daughter he despised. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I did not even blink. I just looked at him with a cold, hollow amusement. I looked at the man who had allowed my mother to abuse me, who had thrown me out on the street when I was pregnant, who had praised a con artist while calling his own flesh and blood a failure. I did not have to say a single word. Before my father could take another aggressive step forward, my lead attorney stepped smoothly and deliberately in front of me. He was a towering, imposing man with a cold, professional demeanor. He placed himself directly between my father-pointing finger and my white Alexander McQueen suit. The attorney looked down at my father with an expression of absolute, profound disdain. He did not raise his voice, but his words cut through the tense air of the boardroom with the sharpness of a guillotine blade. "Excuse me, sir," the attorney said, his voice echoing with devastating clarity. "You need to step back immediately. You are blocking the new chairman of the board." The entire room seemed to hold its breath. My father's hand dropped slowly to his side. The angry red flush drained from his face, leaving him a sickly ashen gray. His brain violently rejected the words he had just heard. He looked from the imposing attorney to my perfectly tailored white suit, and back to the attorney. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound emerged. Behind him, Chloe let out a sharp, strangled gasp that sounded like she was physically choking. My mother buried her face in her hands, letting out a low, terrified moan. Preston collapsed heavily into his leather chair at the head of the table, burying his head in his arms, completely surrendering to the reality of his total destruction. I stepped smoothly around the attorney and walked directly toward the head of the table. The furious billionaire investors, who had been screaming at Preston just moments ago, silently pulled their chairs in to give me a wide, respectful berth. I reached the head of the table and looked down at Preston's shaking form. Then I turned my gaze back to my father, who was still standing frozen in the middle of the room, looking completely and utterly destroyed. I placed my hands flat on the polished mahogany table, claiming the room, the company, and my ultimate revenge. The silence in the boardroom was absolute. I looked around the table, making deliberate, unwavering eye contact with every single billionaire investor and board member present. These were men who had spent their entire lives commanding rooms just like this one. But right now they were completely captivated by the black woman standing at the head of their table. "Gentlemen," I began, my voice ringing out with crystal clarity. "My name is Nia. I am the founder and sole owner of Apex Holdings. For the past 6 months, my acquisitions team has been conducting a forensic audit of this firm. What we found was a house of cards built on staggering financial fraud." I gestured slightly, and my lead attorney began passing thick-bound dossiers down the length of the mahogany table. The investors scrambled to open them, their eyes scanning the highlighted figures, an undeniable proof of their impending ruin. As you can see on page 4, I continued pacing slowly behind Preston. "Apex Holdings has systematically purchased every single one of your outstanding bonds. We have acquired all your bad debt. We bought the leveraged commercial mortgages, the defaulted bridge loans, and phantom equity portfolios. We own it all. You are no longer answering to a consortium of banks. You are answering exclusively to me." Murmurs of shock and outrage rippled through the investors. One of the older men at the far end of the table slammed his fist down. "He told us we were fully capitalized," he barked, glaring at Preston. "He guaranteed a 20% return by the 4th quarter. "He lied to you," I stated flatly, holding the man gaze. "He lied to all of you. Preston firm has not generated a single dollar of actual profit in over 3 years. He has been taking your new capital and using it to pay off the early investors. He has been fabricating property deeds and inflating asset valuations to secure more funding. This is a textbook Ponzi scheme." Preston sprang up from his leather chair, his face a mask of desperate panic. He slammed his hands on the table, trying to reclaim the authority that had just been stripped from him. "Do not listen to her," He screamed, his voice cracking with hysteria. She is a bitter, vindictive liar. I can fix this. I just need a 60-day extension on the bridge loans. The downtown development project is going to close next month, and we will all be incredibly rich. You know me. You know my pedigree. I am a visionary. I let out a harsh, humorless laugh that cut through his pathetic begging. I stepped right up to him, invading his personal space until he was forced to look at me. You are not a visionary, Preston, I said, my words striking him like physical blows. You have absolutely zero talent, you have no business acumen, and you possess no corporate intelligence. The only thing you have ever had is the unearned white privilege of a mediocre man who knows how to wear a tailored suit and use corporate buzzwords. You walked into rooms full of rich men, and they handed you millions of dollars simply because you looked exactly like them. You are a fraud. You are a parasite who feeds on the trust of others. Preston opened his mouth to argue, but no words came out. He looked at the investors, but they were turning their faces away from him, looking at him with absolute disgust. He was entirely alone. And right at this exact moment, I announced, my voice echoing off the glass walls, "You are officially fired. You are stripped of all executive titles, and you are barred from the premises. Security, escort this man out immediately." I snapped my fingers and the heavy mahogany doors swung open. 2 massive private security guards stepped into the boardroom. They moved with terrifying speed, flanking Preston and grabbing him by his arms. "Get your hands off me!" Preston shrieked, thrashing wildly as they lifted him off his feet. "You cannot do this to me. I built this company. I am the president. Let me go." His expensive loafers scraped uselessly against the plush carpet as the guards dragged him backward. He was kicking and screaming, his polished facade completely shattered, revealing the pathetic coward underneath. The investors watched in stunned silence as the supposed financial genius was hauled out of the room like a common trespasser. Suddenly, a piercing shriek shattered the air. Chloe launched herself from the leather chairs against the wall. She scrambled toward me, her face twisted into a mask of pure, feral hatred. Her designer sunglasses flew off her face, revealing eyes wide with madness. "You are a monster," she screamed, lunging forward. "You are a demon." Before Chloe could even get within 3 feet of my pristine white suit, 2 of my private security guards smoothly intercepted her. They did not strike her, but they formed an immovable human wall of solid muscle. Chloe crashed headfirst into them, scratching and clawing at their dark suits like a rabid feral animal, before her knees completely buckled beneath her. She collapsed heavily onto the floor of the boardroom, her expensive designer dress bunching up awkwardly around her thighs, as she began weeping with an ugly, guttural sound that echoed off the glass walls. The billionaire investors who had just witnessed the absolute destruction of the man who had defrauded them had seen enough of the pathetic family drama. Having secured the safety of their investments under my new leadership, they packed up their briefcases with renewed efficiency. One by one, they approached the head of the table. They shook my hand, bowed their heads in profound respect, and offered their enthusiastic support for the new Apex Holdings administration. They filed out of the room in hushed deference. The transition of power was absolute and undeniable. Within 5 minutes, the grand executive boardroom was entirely empty except for my legal team, my security guards, and the 3 shattered remnants of my family. The silence was thick and suffocating, broken only by the sound of Chloe hyperventilating on the carpet. My father was still standing frozen, looking as though all the blood had been violently drained from his veins. But my mother was a completely different breed of survivor. I watched in mild clinical fascination as her deeply ingrained survival instincts kicked in. The furious, entitled woman who had demanded I take out a predatory payday loan just yesterday suddenly vanished into thin air. She smoothed her hair, wiped a stray tear from her cheek, and forced her facial muscles into a trembling, syrupy smile. "Nia, sweetheart?" She began, her voice dripping with an artificial sweetness that made my skin crawl. "Oh, my brilliant, beautiful girl. I always knew you were special. I always knew you had this incredible corporate mind hidden away." She took a tentative step forward, her hands clasped together in a posture of fake maternal pride. "You were just testing us, weren't you? You just needed to show Preston who is really in charge and teach him a lesson about business. Well, you did it, darling. You proved your point magnificently. We are so incredibly proud of you. Now that you own the entire company, we can finally put all this ugly business behind us. You can clear the foreclosure on our house and maybe find a nice, high-paying executive position for your sister. She is going to need the income now that Preston is out of the picture. We can finally be a real family." The sheer breathtaking audacity of her delusion hung in the air. She genuinely believed she could erase decades of emotional abuse, systemic financial theft, and cruel favoritism with a single fake smile. She truly thought my billion-dollar corporate empire was nothing more than a convenient tool to rescue her golden child from the consequences of her own greed. I did not scream. I did not raise my voice. I calmly reached into my Birkin bag. I did not pull out a corporate contract or a legal settlement. I pulled out a small, battered, spiral-bound notebook. The cardboard edges were frayed, and the blue cover was heavily faded from years of being carried in cheap backpacks. I placed it gently on the polished mahogany table. My mother's fake smile faltered as she stared at the worn object. "Do you know what this is, Mom?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously quiet. "I bought this notebook at a dollar store when I was 18 years old. It was the exact same day you and Dad threw me out of the house for getting pregnant with Jamal. I was terrified. I was sleeping on a sagging couch in a tiny apartment, and I had to count every single penny just to afford bus fare and prenatal vitamins. I flipped open the yellowed pages, the sound of the crisp paper unusually loud in the silent room. But I also kept a record in here, a very specific, meticulously detailed record." "What are you talking about?" Nia, my father, finally croaked, finding his voice, though it sounded weak and raspy. "I kept a record of exactly what you stole from me," I said, locking my gaze onto my mother. Widening eyes. "You told me the college fund my grandmother left me had been depleted by sudden market crashes. That was a lie. You drained those accounts to pay for Chloe's lavish destination wedding in the Bahamas. You forged my signature on my childhood savings account and emptied it to buy Preston a vintage Rolex for his birthday just to impress him. You even canceled my health insurance without telling me, pocketing the premium money while I was pregnant and vulnerable, forcing me to rely on state clinics." I traced my manicured nail down the faded ink columns. I tracked every single stolen dollar, every hijacked birthday check, every unearned sacrifice you violently forced me to make so you could prop up the illusion of Chloe's perfect high society life. I did the math. The total amount you systematically stole from your own vulnerable teenage daughter is exactly $12,000. "That is ancient history," my mother stammered, stepping back as her hands fluttered nervously in the air. "We were doing what was best for the family at the time. You were a rebellious teenager making mistakes. You needed to learn hard life lessons. We are your parents, Nia. You owe us your respect and your gratitude." "I owe you absolutely nothing," I countered, my voice slicing through her pathetic defense like a steel blade. I opened my custom leather checkbook and unclipped my gold Mont Blanc pen. I wrote out a check with smooth, deliberate strokes. I signed my name, tore the crisp paper from the ledger, and tossed it onto the glass surface of the table. It fluttered down, landing right next to the battered notebook. "There is a check for exactly $12,000. I stated, my tone echoing with absolute finality. "That is the exact amount you stole from me. Consider it payment in full for the biological transaction of bringing me into this world. Our debts are now completely settled. You will use that money to rent a cheap apartment in a terrible neighborhood because as of 9 o'clock this morning, your colonial house belongs entirely to my holding company, and it is going on the market next week. You have no home, you have no social status, and as of right now, you have no daughter. If you ever try to contact me," I added, my eyes burning into theirs, "if you ever come near my office, my home, or my son, my legal team will bury you in so many harassment lawsuits you will not even be able to afford the bus fare to get to the courthouse. Do not ever call my phone again." I picked up my bag and turned to leave. Suddenly, Chloe let out a primal, desperate wail that sounded entirely inhuman. She scrambled across the corporate carpet on her hands and knees, completely abandoning any remaining shred of her vanity or dignity. Her designer wig was ruined, her makeup was smeared across her face in dark streaks, and she looked utterly unhinged. She lunged forward and wrapped her arms tightly around my ankles, burying her tear-soaked face directly into my shoes. "Nia, please," Chloe sobbed hysterically, her voice muffled against my legs. "I have nothing. Preston is going to federal prison. The bank took my Maserati out of the driveway. My credit cards are all declining. All my country club friends are laughing at me online. You have billions of dollars. You cannot leave me like this. I am your sister. Please give me a job. I will do anything you want. I will clean the floors of this building. Please do not leave me to be poor." I looked down at the weeping, pathetic mess of a woman who had spent 32 years making my life a living hell. She was literally groveling at my feet, begging for the very scraps she had once so cruelly denied me. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel an ounce of guilt. I felt nothing but absolute total liberation. I calmly reached down and gathered the crisp fabric of my pristine white trousers, pulling the hem cleanly out of her desperate, grasping hands. I stepped gracefully over her shaking, sobbing body. I did not look back at my parents standing in the ruins of their shattered lives. I walked out of the boardroom, my heels clicking down the hallway as the heavy doors swung shut behind me, sealing them inside the tomb of their own making. The audio file I had sent from the diner functioned exactly as intended. It was a lit match dropped into a room completely saturated with gasoline. The moment the initial shock of my boardroom exit faded, my family immediately turned their remaining energy toward destroying one another. There was no loyalty among parasites. The federal authorities did not waste any time. The FBI arrived at Preston corporate office the very next morning to execute a highly publicized raid. News helicopters circled overhead, broadcasting the event live across every local channel in Atlanta. I watched from the serene quiet of my own office as federal agents carried out dozens of boxes filled with fabricated financial records. Preston was escorted out of the glass building in handcuffs. His expensive tailored suit wrinkled his face pathetically, hidden behind a manila folder. He was charged with 24 counts of wire fraud embezzlement and running an illegal Ponzi scheme. Given the massive scale of his theft and the sheer number of defrauded investors, the judge firmly denied bail. The brilliant financial genius was going to spend the next several decades in a federal penitentiary. Chloe's reaction to the recording of her husband calling her a toxic monster and eagerly offering to abandon her to save his own skin was instantaneous and vicious. She filed for divorce before Preston even had a chance to secure a defense attorney. However, filing for divorce from a man whose entire portfolio had been seized by federal authorities left her with absolutely nothing. The bank repossessed her beloved Maserati straight out of the impound lot. Her platinum credit cards were permanently canceled. The prestigious country club formally revoked her membership, citing the severe public embarrassment her family had caused their pristine institution. Stripped of her stolen wealth and her fabricated social standing, Chloe was completely exiled from the Atlanta elite she had worshipped. She had no college degree, no marketable skills, and no rich husband to hide behind. The last update I received from my legal team indicated she was renting a tiny rundown studio apartment on the outskirts of the city. She was forced to swallow her immense pride and take a job working double shifts as a hostess at a crowded mid-tier chain restaurant, seating the very people she used to openly mock. My mother attempted one final desperate play. 3 weeks after their humiliating eviction, she managed to bypass my blocked numbers by using a cheap prepaid cell phone. When I answered, I was instantly greeted by the sound of her theatrical, heavy sobbing. "Nia, please, you have to help me," she wailed, her voice trembling with a heavily manufactured frailty. "My blood pressure is dangerously high. The stress of moving into this awful cramped apartment is literally killing me. Your father is a complete mess. He cannot even get out of bed. We have nothing left. We are your parents, Nia. You cannot just leave me sick and suffering like this in my old age. I need my daughter to come and take care of me." She was still blindly trying to pull the old strings of guilt. She was still expecting the discarded scapegoat to rush back and serve the family in their time of need. I listened to her dramatic weeping for a few seconds, feeling absolutely nothing but a profound and absolute peace. "Take the $12,000 and hire a nurse," I said. I ended the call and permanently blocked the number. The very next morning, my chauffeur navigated my Maybach through the pothole-ridden streets of the Lower East Side, pulling up to the curb of a bleak concrete apartment complex. It was a stark, depressing building with peeling gray paint, flickering security lights, and overflowing dumpsters. This was the miserable reality my parents had finally landed in. I stepped out of the plush leather interior of my car, my cashmere trench coat shielding me from the biting autumn wind. I did not come here to gloat. I came here to execute the absolute end of our shared history. Standing by the rusted mailboxes near the entrance was my father, Marcus Sr. He was clutching a plastic grocery bag filled with cheap, generic canned goods, looking nothing like the domineering patriarch who used to aggressively terrorize our household. His shoulders were heavily slumped, his pristine tailored suits replaced by faded sweatpants, and he had easily aged a decade in the span of 3 weeks. He completely froze when he saw me approach. The sheer humiliation radiating off him was palpable. He could barely bring himself to look at my face, his eyes immediately dropping to the cracked pavement. I pulled a thick manila envelope from my bag and held it out to him. His trembling hands hesitated before finally taking it. Inside that envelope is the finalized deed to the colonial mansion. I said, my voice entirely devoid of any emotion. Apex Holdings has officially absorbed the property. The house is mine. You will never set foot on that estate again. He swallowed hard, his Adam apple bobbing as he stared blankly at the envelope. Also in there is a lease agreement for this specific apartment. I continued, gesturing to the dilapidated building behind him. I used my corporate accounts to pay your rent in full for the next 12 months. Marcus Sr. snapped his head up, his eyes wide with shocked disbelief. You paid our rent, he stammered, his voice cracking with a pathetic fragility. After everything we did to you, after the way we treated you, why would you do that, Nia? Because I am not you, I stated simply, looking right through him. I do not throw people out onto the street to starve. I do not prey on the vulnerable, and I do not abandon my fundamental responsibilities. I am paying for this apartment because I absolutely refuse to sink to your level of cruelty. But do not mistake this gesture for affection. This is not an olive branch, and this is certainly not forgiveness. This is a final severance package. I looked at the broken man standing before me, feeling no anger, no sadness, and no longing. The heavy emotional chain that had bound me to his toxic approval for my entire life was permanently severed. You have 1 year of guaranteed shelter, I said, my tone flat and brutally final. 1 year to figure out how to survive without Chloe's stolen money and without my stolen future. After that 12-month lease expires, you are entirely on your own. My biological debt to you is paid. We are strangers now. I turned on my heel and walked back toward my waiting car. I did not wait for his apology or his excuses. I simply let the cold wind and the heavy silence speak for themselves. Marcus Sr. stood frozen on the cracked concrete, clutching the manila envelope tightly to his chest. As he watched the sleek taillights of my Maybach disappear down the gloomy street, the crushing, agonizing weight of his reality finally settled over him. He realized in that profound, lonely moment that in his blind pursuit of artificial status and his foolish worship of a con artist, he had maliciously thrown away the only person who could have saved him. He had lost his most precious gem, and he would have to live the rest of his miserable life, knowing his destruction was entirely his own fault. The heavy steel doors of my private elevator slid open with a soft musical chime, revealing the expansive sunlit foyer of my penthouse. I stepped over the marble threshold, leaving the toxic remnants of my past far behind me in that desolate neighborhood. I took a deep, cleansing breath. The air up here felt entirely different. It was light and pure and completely free of the suffocating tension that had choked me for my entire childhood. The massive floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline, the very city I had just conquered. Warm, golden hour light poured over the plush, modern furniture, the vibrant art on the walls, and the pristine hardwood floors. This was not a house built on fraud, stolen money, or superficial appearances. It was an impenetrable sanctuary built on relentless hard work and undeniable truth. Before I could even take off my cashmere trench coat, 2 small tornadoes of energy came barreling down the long hallway. Mommy Jamal yelled, his face lighting up with absolute joy as he sprinted toward me. Right behind him was my brilliant daughter Zuri, her natural curls bouncing as she raced to catch up with her older brother. I dropped my designer bag onto the console table and sank to my knees, opening my arms wide. They crashed into me, burying their little faces in my neck and wrapping their arms tightly around my shoulders. The sound of their pure, unfiltered laughter echoed through the massive penthouse. I held them close, breathing in the sweet scent of their hair, feeling a profound, overwhelming surge of gratitude. This was my real wealth. This was the empire that actually mattered. Dinner that evening was a loud, chaotic, and beautiful affair. We sat around the massive custom oak dining table, eating a simple, home-cooked meal. There was no walking on eggshells. There were no snide, passive-aggressive remarks about my appearance or my career choices. There was no golden child to compete with, and no impossibly toxic standards to meet. We just talked and laughed and shared stories about our day. We spilled juice, and we made a mess, and we simply existed in a space overflowing with unconditional love. It was a space entirely devoid of toxicity and absolutely free of judgment. Later, as the evening settled into a quiet calm, I walked over to the towering glass windows and looked out over the glowing city. I turned slowly to face forward, looking directly into the lens of reality. They called me a failure because I refused to live by their definitions. They stripped me of everything just to build their fake facade. But they forgot one crucial thing. You cannot bury a seed. Revenge is not about screaming or hitting. The sweetest revenge is standing at the pinnacle looking down as the people who trampled you destroy their own lives. I am Nia, and I have taken everything back. A heavy rhythmic bass dropped, filling the space with a powerful soulful rhythm and blues melody. The music swelled, surging with an undeniable triumphant energy as the sprawling illuminated skyline slowly faded to black.